Are we seeing the thaw of the crypto winter as Bitcoin is sat at around $90,000? Well, welcome to the Open Source Podcast. Today I'm joined by Zackary Skelly, Head of Talent, and Chris Ahsing, Talent Partner at Dragonfly Capital. And please remember that everyone's views today that are shared are of their own and not reflective of their employer. Well, welcome, Zach and Chris. It's great to have you both on the pod today. And to start things off, I'd love to get you guys to do a brief intro of yourselves and maybe a quick blurb on your experience to date.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having us. Mind if I just go first, Chris, and I'll turn it over to you?
There you go.
Cool. So I'm Zach. I am the head of talent at Dragonfly, and I've been here since May of 2021, so I guess about 3.5 years now. Chris has been on the team. I want to say, I can't remember. Is it coming up on 2 years at this point?
Coming up on 2 years.
And I guess our team does a wide variety of work across the portfolio and the firm, including driving our internal hiring, a lot of advisory stuff, assisting with searches and getting folks to the right roles across the portfolio. Before this, I ran recruiting at a company in the space called 0x, did something similar at an analytics startup called Heap prior to that. And then many years ago, I was doing engineering recruiting at Dropbox a few years before they went public, actually with Chris. And Chris and I also used to work together for a little bit of time at Google prior. So I've known each other for a long time and feel really fortunate to have him on the team here. It's a TLDR on my end, I guess.
Yeah. Chris Ahsing, everybody. Been in recruiting for 15, 16 years now. As Zach mentioned, been here for almost 2 years on the talent side, primarily kind of focusing on working with founders and just networking with candidates. I also handle a lot of the ops and internally and externally, kind of like reporting, analytics, system processes, tooling, and then partnerships with Bruce and everyone for the portfolio and connecting founders and Bruce when there's a big need in that end. As Zach mentioned, been recruited together at Google, Dropbox. Before this, I was leading technical recruiting at Plaid, a fintech startup, for about 5 years, and kind of been all over the place, kind of 0 to 1, 1 to 1,000, that kind of fun stuff. Did some consulting at Jump Trading, Jump Capital, so second foray into the VC landscape, and then have touched just a variety of things, I think, in people, talent, and then got into crypto fully, I think, as I joined the team.
Thank you both. And I think it's great to have you both on with across tech recruiting and especially into the crypto and Web3 space. If you guys don't know it across the recruiting landscape, it's probably not worth knowing. So I appreciate that. Well, there's been a lot of buzz lately, obviously around the Web3, the crypto space, Bitcoin breaking through as well, the 80K barrier just this week. But we're still seeing some ups and downs. From your perspective, and feel free for either of you to fill this one, but what's kind of the current market trends from your perspective, and how does that impact talent?
Yeah. I mean, so if it's helpful, every quarter we actually do a pretty deep dive into some analytics and based on a variety of different things, but including interest that we see from the portfolio in candidates, interest that we see in candidates in getting matched to different opportunities across the portfolio. We do a bunch of kind of anecdotal analysis of like sentiment and trends from candidates and that kind of a thing. And across all these different key metrics that we've been seeing, I will say that it seems like the market is definitely on a little bit of a tear right now. That might seem somewhat obvious, just given like kind of the external hype cycle, but we actually saw like a little bit of a dip in the middle of the year where at least the number of jobs that were being posted by our portfolio kind of dropped around July. They then rebounded though and have since been at like record highs. Like even as the portfolio has grown and we've onboarded more and more companies, definitely more jobs than we've ever seen posted. And I think that's a good kind of like proxy metric for what's happening in the market more broadly. There are probably some trends within that too that we could dive into, but is that kind of what you're looking for? Just like overall, what are we seeing, or kind of more specific things?
Yeah, let's dive into some of the specifics. That'd be great.
Sure. The first one that comes to mind for me is APAC has definitely increased significantly on our radar. So we're seeing more and more teams hiring in Asia, especially as I guess better product market fit has happened out that way. handful of go-to-market roles seem to be opening almost all the time in that area of the world. Wondering if there are other trends that come to mind for you immediately, Chris.
Yeah, I think, and we did our report or look back into the quarter right before the election. So we started seeing things kind of open up a bunch. I think this year, as we looked in the market, a major focus has been APAC expansion, and we saw a lot of roles starting to open up around like go-to-market, BD, partnership, ecosystems out in Asia. And I think a lot of people caught wind from that. And so I think from like a product company life cycle, it's like, this past year last year we saw, people, either hunkering down, being really focused in terms of what they're building or pivoting, I think, into, hey, what works? What's the direction? Coming out of that, we saw, a bunch of the companies in the portfolio tend to hit product market fit, start to get some life even in the bear market in terms of what's useful, what's humming in that end. Obviously, there's always some chasing of like, hype and, something riffs and everybody's going toward it in that way. But we saw a pretty consistent trend along the side of like this product life cycle and then been push, I think, earlier to like middle of this year into APAC and just to complement what Zach said around just a gigantic increase in roles being hired out there. A lot of life, right? Like things are starting to turn on there. And I think, we're excited. We're, cautiously optimistic, I think, in where this goes. I think in the US, and US catches up in hiring. I will finish with just noting one really interesting kind of signal that we started getting was a lot more portfolio companies asking for recruiting support, hiring internal recruiting again, which has been non-existent the past couple of years simply because of where everything was at. But it was this interesting, like, okay, companies are starting to turn on the lights and engine in terms of like growth again. And so, really excited to see where everything goes, I think, at this point. But that seems to be a major trend, I think, at a macro level. Zach, I don't know if you want to, pop over to some maybe of the candidate stuff or individual roles that we're starting to see or trends on that side. But that's it from me.
Yeah. No, we can talk about that a little bit for sure. I think you touched on an interesting thing too, around the US specifically. We've kind of been wondering what the presidential election might do in the market here in the US and whether that's going to like kind of equalize things with the growth that we've been seeing in APAC. Still a little bit TBD. I mean, it's early, but I am intrigued. I'm optimistic, and personally, I'm kind of assuming that we might see like a very large hiring spike in probably like Q1, Q2 of the year. It's hard to say, but there's always historically like a little bit of a slowdown around the holidays and teams start planning headcount for the new year and that kind of thing. Beyond that, if there's like really aggressive price action after a presidential election, I think that can encourage teams to do a little bit more hiring. And it also seems as though most candidates that ran on a crypto platform in the US ended up kind of getting elected. So I'm very curious to see like, what is the regulatory landscape going to look like over the next couple of years? And I think that's going to have an impact too in one way or another. Yeah, I'm optimistic there might be like a really big kind of innovation boon that happens in the space and thus, a bunch of new hiring there too. But we'll see. I just think it's kind of an interesting juncture right now. But yeah, we also do kind of pay attention to more micro level trends, I guess. So like, are there certain functions that seem to be hiring more or hiring less quarter over quarter or year over year? And we've been seeing some interesting things there too. I'm actually like looking at a couple of notes on the side here, trying to remember what was most salient that kind of came from this analysis. But TLDR is like every single job function that we track ended up seeing growth quarter over quarter, which hasn't always been the case. So, from software engineering through design, through accounting, legal, data science, customer success, like Chris said, recruiting and HR really picked up a good bit. There were a couple of areas that intrigued us in terms of these roles. Like, for example, we saw a pretty strong renewed focus on design recently. We also try to look at things kind of year over year, at least like a snapshot of each quarter. So for example, like Q3 2023 versus Q3 2024. And this time last year, there was actually like very minimal design hiring happening that we were aware of. So the fact that we've kind of seen this spike in design hiring over the last quarter or two makes us wonder if there's kind of a shift towards new feature development or more kind of like greenfield initiatives that might demand a bigger design team versus kind of a deeper dive into like specialized engineering work, which we still see hires for. But yeah, I guess the other big standout was on the people and recruiting front, like Chris mentioned. And to us, I think that just kind of reflects expanded capacity to support scaling. TLDR, everything seems to be on the upswing. My intuition is that in light of some of what's happening politically, we might see more of an aggressive push to come, but hard to definitively say, if that makes sense.
Definitely. No, that makes sense. And to mirror that on the design side, we've seen that uptick pretty heavily as well. And some of the feedback that we're getting is, hey, how do we actually, from a design perspective and a usability perspective, how are we bringing crypto into the mainstream, right? And allowing your general public to use and adopt the technologies that have been developed over the past number of years. So I think it's interesting to see that focus now on how do we actually foster and encourage mainstream adoption. And I think that comes with the confidence in the market as well, right? And potential regulatory changes over the next kind of 12 to 24 months. So yeah, there's a lot of intrigue there to see where the market's going. I think it's a real pivotal kind of inflection point now, which is really exciting for the positive, which is really exciting. And with some of the rapidly changing dynamics all the time, what are some of the, I suppose for me, I'm going to talk about hiring strategies here and how you kind of help founders adopt those. One thing that I've really pushed with founders is being proactive from when you start your company for these niche areas. Chip away at building your network of protocol engineers, protocol security engineers, smart contracts engineers, and auditors, etc. Because they're going to be they're those areas that could trip you up in your growth plans, I think, at times. But what are some of the hiring strategies that you found have worked with startups across the portfolio or in the past kind of lives and roles, particularly when resources are tight or looking to scale quickly? What do you see kind of what is the differentiators between founders and companies that are scaling fast and successfully versus those that struggle?
Yeah, I can jump in here, Zach, in this end. And I think this is like our standard playbook that I think we kind of offer advice to founders, and that's just optimizing every channel in the sense, like go congregate where talent congregates is a better way of saying that, and focus on, marketing, branding for inbound, do a bit of the outreach and networking, as you mentioned, is like a big key to that aspect of it. Really focus on growing your team organically through, knowing your team's referrals and who do they know, and spending a lot of time just kind of like learning that's where founders should be spending time, because it's simple, right? Like all these things I think people know to do, but it's just like, hey, how do I as a founder prioritize hiring, especially if it's slow growth in a lot of ways, and making sure you're carving out every week some time to do these things.
Yeah.
And then partnering with the right agency, the right partner in terms of the when you need a shot in the arm, when you have a tricky role, you need to hire quickly, spending the time in evaluating, I think, the right folks to come in and do that. Because there is an unsaid cost, I think, on time when you're just bringing in the wrong agency, the wrong partner. So this has kind of been our strategy. I think Change, Bruce, and you and I talked a lot about this. Of just like, hey, making sure we're only working with the few that we've gotten really good references from, that we know, hey, if we were to exit or not be as close to a team or a founder, that they're in good hands in terms of just focusing on, hey, is this the right hire? Is this actually the role that you need today? And then, hey, how do you go about tactically doing that and attracting the right folks? And so to summarize, I think in this end, optimize every channel, carving out time for founders to kind of do these things, and then partnering with the right folks is stereotypically our pretty common hiring strategies that we've seen. And then there's just always fixing. There's always fixes, right? There's always like random stuff that we come in and have to provide a little bit of guidance to. Not a ton, in the sense of like, your process is too long, or hey, think about compensation a little bit more effectively, or we like to leave everyone saying like, hey, you should treat every candidate like a customer. That's the best way to do it in terms of experience, right? Treat everybody that they're going to use your product at some point in time. So try not to ghost folks, right? Try to give a good experience, right? I know everybody says candidate experience is key, but I think if you put it like that for founders, like, hey, every person you should touch is they're going to be a user at some point. So you want to leave them with a good taste in their mouth is typically, without the getting into the weeds a bit, that's the hiring advice, not necessarily strategies that we typically say, hey, this is what you should focus on. And I know I'm adding on one more thing here, but this plus with the market rebounding and getting back to being a little bit more competitive than it has been in a couple of years, really key, right? Really key to focus on this stuff now.
1,000%. And you spoke earlier on about the hiring of talent and recruiters again, and that bubbling back up to the surface, which we've seen absolutely zero of pretty much in the last 12 to 18 months. At what point are you seeing companies push the button and say, hey, we're ready to make that hire? Is there generally any triggers that you see that bring about that hire as a first-time talent or recruiter into the organization?
I have a couple of thought points, but Zach, I don't know if you want to jump in on this one, if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I think a rule of thumb that I often tell people, or what I most commonly see is, if you're planning to hire probably 10 or more people in the next 9 months or so, and you anticipate that you're going to continue hiring from there, it might make sense to bring on somebody to just kind of manage the process internally. There could be exceptions to that, but again, just kind of a rule of thumb. I'm curious if you would agree with that, Chris, or if there's anything else that kind of immediately comes to mind for you. But
yeah, I think there's a couple principles that we tend to obviously hiring needs are key. The way I'd frame it for founders is hey, what does your bandwidth look like? Do you have time to really focus on this? Is a big one in terms of hiring. The second one is, funding, right? You're going to get an interjection of capital. What are you going to use that for? Is it growth? Is it expansion? Growth and expansion, same thing. But is it company growth? Is it BD expansion? Is it product expansion? Kind of chasing revenue. And then, the last one I would say is just you're having a hard time, right? You're having a hard time getting the right people in that end. But I come back to the just being smart about your headcount growth. It's not the days of just massive scale and throwing people at a problem. Do you really need a recruiter in some cases, right? Can you actually get away with hiring maybe somebody from a partner, a contractor, so to speak, to kind of help you make sure you're not bloated as an organization? I think operational excellence and operational efficiency has probably been a big topic this last couple of years in that end. So to recap, I think it's just hey, founder bandwidth. Can you do it effectively? Do you have the time? To you got to being smart with the capital that you raise. And then 3, is it problems you're facing?
Yeah.
Do you really, underlying all of that is hey, do you actually need a recruiter?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the bandwidth piece is definitely an important consideration, and especially for early stage teams, we're often telling them, founders should be probably spending a considerable amount of time on recruiting themselves, and in the vast majority of cases, it's arguably one of the highest leverage things that you can be doing as a founder. The other thing that comes to mind, and this was going through my head too when we were discussing the last question, what are teams considering when they're kind of most successful around hiring is this, I guess, trilemma that we often talk about around speed, cost, and quality. Meaning anytime you're in a hiring situation, you're looking at these 3 things, and you're probably really only going to be able to optimize for 2 at a given time. So if you're trying to hire, really high quality talent fast, it's probably going to be pretty costly, for example. I think you can kind of factor that into when you might want to bring somebody in-house to help handle things too. It's kind of directly related to bandwidth in my mind. But if you were to kind of abstract away a lot of those variables, I think kind of this rule of thumb of, roughly if you're planning to hire 10 people in the next 9 months ish or more, and then you anticipate that you're going to have future headcount growth, accounting for potential attrition and, how the team might expand, that can be a time where it's useful to have somebody running point, and just overall in terms of a founder's general bandwidth as a company grows. But yeah, Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that I talk so much about is proactivity, right? And you might not be ready to push the button on making that hire across a talent or as a recruiter, but set yourself up for success as a founder early on. Build a database. There's plenty of freemium style ATS platforms now, or you can use Notion as a table, or even just an Excel spreadsheet. But start building up that town square of talent and that community, and engage with them continuously over your growth period, and key milestones that you hit. And then when you come to make hires, you're in a great spot to already have that baseline of a pipeline or people that are bought in that can give you bigger referrals. You extend your referral network, and that might be 2-3 years until you actually scale through your startup journey. But being able to draw upon that, and you're building not only your customer community, but you're building like your talent, your people community, because that's going to play such a key role in your growth down the road. And if you've got that buy-in and that brand, employer brand right away, it takes time to build that story, right? It's not just like setting up a LinkedIn live page and off you go with success from the talent perspective. So I always try and advise people, the sooner you can start, even if you don't have a full-time member of staff on recruiting, invest in, whether it's a software, there are free versions, or just start tracking in notes or something that your talent pool, so that you can really draw upon that down the track until you're ready to make that hire.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Yeah. One of the other areas that I wanted to touch upon is flipping it to the candidate side, right? What advice would you give at the moment for candidates looking for their next opportunity within crypto? Are there key things that they should focus on, or any key kind of channels that you're seeing that are bringing success for hiring across the portfolio that candidates can leverage or utilize?
Yeah.
Key thing.
I mean, if I'm taking like our advice to founders of optimizing every channel, I think candidates should do the same, right? Like, hey, I think you hear the stories that it's really rough. I think for a lot of candidates out there trying to apply, you're sending thousands of applications in, very little response. I think it's key to do a couple of things. One, a little bit of the numbers game, sure, like that's still pretty standard. Two, I think leveraging their own networks, and then people they've worked with, where they're at, still going out, making those connections, talking to folks in that end, which I think is pretty standard at this point in time. Three, this one's interesting. This one, we've talked to a lot of teams, I think, in their interview process of wanting to see their GitHub, right? We've had a lot of teams evaluate candidates on their open source contributions, which makes it really difficult because a lot of times teams, people individually will have their repositories private in that sense. But I think not to just fall in the trap of just saying, hey, show your GitHub or be more active on GitHub. I think what is missing from what we see in a lot of companies and talking about candidates and their open source contribution is like, are you contributing to something notable, right? If you're just forking something and making a pet project or building your own individual bot, great, right? Like that's great. But I think what would go a long way is like, you're actually contributing into the major ecosystems that are there, and you're getting on board with like some pretty notable projects, or you're doing some notable work in that end. Which once again, I hear it. Like I a ton of friends that are candidates in engineering and all across the place. Like it's hard to do that when you have a full-time job. But if you're actively in the market, it's just going to make things a little bit easier, and hopefully it doesn't feel like you're just trying to get a job, right? You're actually building in the space. You're doing things that are notable on that end. So to summarize, one, numbers game, apply. Two, network. It's network with folks you've worked with. Reach out to different. Reach out to Bruce. Have him help you out a little bit there. Three, if you make a notable high quality web footprint on the open source, in terms of projects that you're working on, that's a big one. That's a lot more teams are evaluating candidates not even at the resume, like at the resume review stage in their open source. Like if you have a link on your resume to your GitHub, they're if they're taking a look, it's make sure you're pretty buttoned up and polished and focused on the right things there.
Yeah, I think Chris touched on a lot of the same stuff that I would generally say. very high level advice would be, to the best of your ability, kind of like try to think like a recruiter. Think like a recruiter at a company who sees a very, very high volume of applications. And I might catch a little bit of flack for this, but to be honest with you, I think the vast majority of recruiters, maybe the most effective thing that you can do to get your foot in the door in one of these companies is have reputable, notable things in your background. So that means good schools, high quality companies, or like Chris mentioned, notable open source projects. Like open source work in general is a good thing, but working on something that teams are going to recognize or recruiters are going to recognize when they glance at your resume, I think that's going to be the first thing that opens doors. And I realize that that's not always going to be possible for people, and that may also not be the best metric to indicate that somebody is a strong engineer or strong at whatever it is that they might do. But I'm just saying, I do think realistically, that's the first thing that's going to catch a recruiter's eye when they're looking at your resume. So that's kind of like maybe the easiest way to get your foot in the door. Beyond that, and as you're kind of like building that credibility and getting into those types of organizations, I think Chris's point about open source work and having some public footprint is really notable and important. And again, to Chris's point, if you can contribute to reputable projects, or something that again is going to trigger something when a recruiter sees that name, I think that can go a long way. The level of ownership and kind of technical complexity to what you're building too, I think can often speak to a lot of recruiters. And it doesn't necessarily have to just be code. I also think like writing can go a really long way. And whether or not you're an engineer, if you're running a Substack, or if you have a Twitter account where you're tweeting things that are getting retweeted by notable people, I think that can also be a pretty good indicator to somebody who's evaluating candidates that you might be a good fit. Even just the network that you build on those platforms themselves can be really valuable. Like if I were to go to somebody's Twitter page and I saw they were followed by 80 or 90 people who I really respect, that's probably immediately going to trigger something in my head that makes me think like, okay, this is worth diving a little bit more deeply into. A lot of those folks, it might be hard to get them to follow you, so network deeply and with people who might have other good kind of tangential connections. And then I think, optimizing for high value skills in the space, developing those skills can be a really useful tip too. So, there are certain types of tech that are really useful in the industry. We see more and more and more Rust development happening. So, maybe familiarizing yourself with Rust, for example, might be a way to get your foot in the door in the engineering world, or demonstrating some pretty strong competency in Solidity, writing smart contracts. There's always a very high demand for skilled folks in that world. If you're in BD, for example, if you have some APAC BD experience, given this, APAC expansion, again, I think like trying to build your career around like trends in the space can be useful. And then lastly, I would say, if you can kind of like play to the market cycle a little bit too, and read the market cycle and angle yourself appropriately, I think that can also go a long way. One thing we've seen is I think bear markets, from a recruiting perspective, it tend to kind of attract like vision aligned types of builders, like people who really believe in like the ethos of the industry and the mission of the industry, and are kind of inspired to put their heads down and build something that's probably going to reap substantial reward when the market comes back. And historically it always has. Whereas I think bull markets, when things are kind of plastered all over the news, a lot of the time this, at least from a company side, seems to kind of open the door more to like talent that's new to the space. So Web2 talent, TradFi talent. And thinking about what I'm saying a little bit more, I'm not sure that that's as useful of an anecdote from a candidate's perspective, but maybe one thing to take away from that as a candidate would be, if you are in a bear market, applying during those times, I think might help companies understand that you have high conviction in this space. And that's always a good thing to communicate broadly. Last things I guess I would say is like, I do think cold outreach can be effective. Just make sure that you're sending something that's tailored and compelling. So like Chris was saying, optimize all your channels. One of those channels might be, reaching out to founders, reaching out to hiring teams yourself. I would say get right to the point and kind of express why they're interesting to you and why you think you would be a good match for them. Yeah, those are some of the first things that kind of come to mind, if that's helpful.
Yeah, I just jumping in here, as Zach has been talking, two ideas that I wanted to kind of expand on. The first one, and Zach, I think you've had quite a bit of experience of like hiring people from people who are working and building upon your project. I think from your days at ZeroX, like I think you hired a lot of really great people who are actually, working on building on top of ZeroX is really key. So I think if you're being intent, and this aligns with, I think, Zach's like, hey, aligning with a vision and mission. Like I think if you're not only being really intentional on where you're applying to and putting that time and effort, I think goes a long way for founders that are looking at you going like, okay, you believe, you get it. I want founders more and more now want people who are going to be for the long haul and build. So I think that's a really big key on that end. Same thing with the writing, right? In interacting with projects. The other thing that I would mention that I've seen candidates get a lot of interest, and like a lot of founders wanted to talk about, it's like hackathon winners. I know it's cliche, right? You've seen people with very interesting different backgrounds that are just like, hey, I won ETH Denver, this hackathon, this project.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Gets picked up, and you get a little bit of notability, I think, in that end. So, crypto is such a great community in terms of just building and the ecosystem and all these things. Like it more than I think general tech, this goes a long way.
Yeah, those are two really good points, and no, I appreciate that you mentioned that about ZeroX. Yeah, we did hire a good number of people that were just kind of building on our open source projects, submitting commits. We would pay attention to that and kind of reach out to folks and engage the ones who were doing meaningful work. It doesn't even have to just be engineering. A good friend of mine whose name is Brent, who ran community at ZeroX for a long time, came from a very, very different world in terms of his career. And he actually mapped out in the early days, kind of like the entire ZeroX community, graphic designed it, printed it out, mailed it to the office, and just kind of did some of the work, like demonstrated value to our specific project. And I would say that's a really helpful strategy. Like if you want to work on a specific team, go build on their tech, and it gives them a lot more to kind of look into around whether you might be a good fit. I just want to echo what Chris said too. Hackathons didn't immediately come to mind, but I think that mentality and certain hackathons in this space carry a lot of credibility with teams, and there's a low barrier to entry. You can go and participate in those hackathons in almost any case, so that's a really good way to kind of get started, get networked, put something on your resume that has credibility in the industry and shows a deeper level of interest and kind of involvement, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. That's fantastic insights. And I think that will help any candidate with their search. And just to recap, having a 360 view on what your actual presence in the overall market looks like. Your resume is just one facet nowadays. LinkedIn, Substack blogs, your network, getting to events, all those things have a big impact. And then building credibility as well was one of the other big key things there. Building credibility, getting out there to hackathons, being proactive within certain communities, whether that is AI or Web3 or security or whatever your domain is, going out and building that credibility and being proactive there as well. No, absolutely incredible insights there. Thank you both for those. And switching gears a little here, then we're all talent professionals on the episode today, but AI is making a huge impact, right, across all industries, and hiring is no exception, right? Like I think how do we see the landscape shifting with AI tools impacting hiring, both from, I suppose, our own kind of perspectives and maybe from a founder perspective? Do we see any big trends there that we think are going to impact? One for me, and I don't want to jump the gun here, would be I'm starting to see AI interviews crop up and how AI interviewers can play a role in the hiring process, whether that is replacement of the interviewer or enabling the interviewer to be, asking questions and probing outside of their technical purview.
Yeah, I think the thing that jumps out for me at the moment in the space, and this might be a little bit of a different direction that I think you're taking it in, Bruce, but one thing that has been big is like there's just philosophical discussion happening right now. Like, how do you evaluate someone that uses AI in an interview?
Yeah.
A co-pilot, ChatGPT to help answer questions and I think there's like two kind of discussions going on. Is like, hey, it's going to be an everyday thing. Like using AI in your job is going to be more relevant, and you shouldn't discount someone using that in terms of their skill set because they're going to use it on the job, right? We always try to preach like have interviews that are more closely associated to the work that they'll be doing. So how do you incorporate that? How do you evaluate that in? And the other side is like, some founders and some teams are really considering that of like not a true reflection of someone's abilities,
Yeah.
right? Kind of a crutch. I don't have a good answer or stance on this. We kind of see it on both ends and both ways of like, you can use it every day. Why not use it in interviews? Other side, is that truly an accurate reflection of someone's success in the company? Not sure how we're going to approach that. Not sure where the tooling and process and types of interviews that are going to be mature over time in this. But that's been the discussion, and a lot of times, like, I've seen teams be okay with it. I've seen teams reject candidates directly once they find that is. I think if it, from a candidate perspective, I would say be thoughtful. Be thoughtful in how to use these tools, right? We've definitely seen take-home submissions and the like where it's clearly just a copy paste, right? It's like put in a little bit more effort than that, I guess, is what I would say. But not sure. Zach, I don't know if you have any more thoughts on just like how teams are using interviews and evaluation.
Yeah.
I spent a lot of time on this during my previous life when we were looking at how do we add more options for candidates to take interviews. But I'll pause there and Zach to add any context or flavor.
Yeah. No, I have a lot of thoughts on this. I'm just trying to collect them all. No, I mean, I'm a fan, honestly, of all these different tools and AI that's coming out in the market. I mean, I spend a considerable amount of my own free time trying to convince Claude that it's sentient, and I think it's a very useful tool. It's becoming more and more of a prevalent thing in the world, and I think it's just going to continue to be that way. So, to me, I agree with Chris that like the philosophy around this is pretty rapidly evolving. But in my mind, the best interviews are those that are kind of emulative of real world work. And I think the fact of the matter is like people are going to be using these tools on the job. So personally, like my inclination is I'm not opposed to people using these tools in interviews, assuming they're going to be able to use them in the real world. I do think the big thing is like discernment. Like Chris said, we might see people that are just kind of copy and pasting and coming up with stuff that is not of the quality that a company is looking for. And obviously that's going to be a flag. But if it's just like using these tools to augment first principles thinking and doing so in a skillful way and being able to discern, just be copy pasted and, what do you actually need to change to do the work that you're trying to submit? To me, that's pretty perfectly legitimate. And I mean, I remember seeing an article just a couple of weeks ago that I think like 25% of Google's code base at this point, or it might be 25% of new code that's getting contributed to Google's code base is written by AI, and that doesn't mean that, engineers aren't going back and like looking at this stuff and making it fit. But again, like these are tools that are used in the real world. And I think personally, like it's overall generally fair to let people use them in their work. I don't think it should replace first principles thinking, and I don't think that AI is like at a point yet where it's sophisticated enough to do that. But I do think, as long as you have good discernment, it's a sensible thing. And if somebody can use one of these tools and that's all it really takes to get your interviews or your job done, it might really be a matter of like rescoping your job. Like do you really need to hire an elite kind of senior level engineer if all you're really looking for is something that can get spit out of like a large language model? Maybe you need to hire somebody who's a little bit less skilled and has a different skill set, and that could include like using these types of tools. So that might be like a little bit of a long-winded thing, and I do feel like that's a pretty strong philosophical take. I'm not trying to like undermine the importance of first principles thinking. I'm just saying, like, stay aware of how quickly this stuff is evolving and be realistic that people are actually going to be using these things in the real world. And that's in the context of like candidates' work. You brought up another really interesting point, Bruce, which I've only recently started giving more thought to because I've only kind of started seeing it happen more recently. But like AI interviewers, for example, that's a little bit of a different thing. And I'm curious what your take on this is. But my hesitation there from a company perspective would be that I don't know how high touch it is. And like, I don't know if that's going to be effective for like really elite talent that has a lot of opportunity in front of them. is it too impersonal? Does it give you an opportunity to build rapport early on? Or are people going to see it as efficient? In my mind, it kind of reminds me of like these tools like HackerRank, for example, and how companies would sometimes administer this as like a first round interview. You know, like before you get the chance to speak to a human being, you have to do this coding test. And again, I've seen a lot of really strong candidates feel some aversion to that. Like there's not a level of investment from the company in them before they have to go ahead and put in significant work. So my intuition is that it may not be high touch enough for elite talent to like first point of contact be an AI screen, but I'm open-minded towards what that might evolve to look like. And I'm curious if you've seen anything different or interesting on your end.
Yeah, a lot of conversations that I've had is how actually can AI support a recruiter, right, during the interview. And I've seen and demoed tools through looking at investment, etc., that are looking to replace the interviewer, where you hop on a link and you're interacting with an AI and an AI agent or such forth, and that is asking you questions. You answer, it then asks a follow up, and it's doing essentially a technical interview, and then it scorecards you as the candidate and ranks you based on your performance. The where I think it's going, and you're absolutely right, you've got to have that personal touch. You're going to be working with humans, right? And I think in recruiting, and maybe this will change down the road, maybe everybody's perceptions will change. But if you look at trends right now where, hey, do a elite code or a CoderPad exercise as the first round, the drop-off rate in candidates is pretty steep. But from a how can we support a recruiter like ourselves to do a technical screen where it prompts the question, we ask it, it can ask follow-ups, you can then build that rapport still, you're working through. I think there is a space for that for sure, especially in niche, high skill positions. Maybe very different for high scale roles at big tech, big FANG companies. Maybe there is a full replacement there opportunity. But I just think if we look at trends today and behavioral trends, you would lose a lot of candidates from the outset, and I don't think we're there yet either, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, to me, so were you going to say something, Chris? Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, I think the three main points that I would, talk to people about and caution founders on is like from the candidate perspective, I think AI is a great tool to help you communicate, right? Structure, interview. That's where I've seen it the most valuable for folks, especially if you're not great in live questions and live interviews in that end. I think it's wonderful for that. On the founder side and team side, like with the AI evaluative interviewing tools, the thing that I try to caution on is like, one, a model is only as good as the data it's trained on. That's key. One. Two, although it's not a person, how does this model still present bias with candidates? Yeah. And that's a big topic that's kind of evolving in discussion. It's like, okay, this might not be a person evaluating and grading and rejecting or hiring somebody, but there's still some level of constraint with the model and data that the tool is built on in a lot of ways. So that's the caution, and yeah, it'll get better over time. But I think of it as like, look, if it saves your time and you have you have a personal touch, there's a personal touch. You're not just, using this as a crutch to just, skip a step or cut a corner. And you're being thoughtful about how and, having someone look at someone's results or score or interview. I think that's key. But that's it. So, to summarize, great at communicating, structure, interviews, to be very aware that there might be biases built in a model in that sense and tool. 3, you still don't cut a corner.
Yeah.
The most important thing you're doing for your company is hiring and building, like bringing in the right people in the 4 walls. So, it needs to be thoughtful. It needs to have very considerable like installation, I think, in some of these tools into your process.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I mean, like two other quick thoughts that came to mind. I've played with a lot of different AI tools. I'm kind of constantly playing with them because I think there are ways that you can really enhance workflows and be more effective. That I would agree with Chris, though, that I personally I don't know that the models that I've seen are well trained enough on this specific data to extract signal from noise. Nor do I know that they're like evaluating holistically enough. Like they might not be looking at somebody's social media or open source presence, and they really might miss important signal. So I could be wrong. There could be models and tools that I'm unaware of that are a little bit better than others or those that I've played with, but I just personally haven't seen something, at least on like the resume screening front, that has instilled complete confidence in me, for what it's worth. And then the other thing that kind of came to mind again was just like the speed, cost, quality thing again. Like if you're going to have an AI agent kind of taking first calls or even helping do first pass on resume review, like this may help you with speed. It may ultimately save you some money in terms of like recruiter time or founder time or whatever it is. But quality might suffer. Like you might be optimizing for those two things, speed and cost, and at the expense of something else. So just worth keeping it in mind. I'm not saying that this isn't going to improve and very rapidly. It certainly could, but that's just kind of like my take on where things are to date, if that's fair.
1,000%. I think there's still a lot of development to be done. It's been built, and I've spoken to a few companies that are in stealth mode right now on the interviewer side. I think it's going to be interesting to see where it heads. But yeah, I think there's a lot to discern at the moment. Is an AI talking to an AI? At the moment, we can't discern that a lot of time as humans. And I actually heard a story the other day of where somebody did a whole 45-minute interview, and in the end, they started to like think, is this a real person? And that's how insane it was. And then they got the person to hold their hands up, and AI didn't do hands very well. It didn't back then when they did it, and the hand was all strange, and they realized that they were been talking 45 minutes to an AI.
Yeah, it's wild.
Which is wild and crazy. And so I think we've got a lot of developing to do and a lot of work to be done. But I think it's exciting for our space to see where maybe some of those efficiencies could be driven in our roles day to day as well.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm definitely not saying
like live whiteboard coding interviews coming back sometime soon, right? Like I think face-to-face interviews are going to be a thing again, more so than any.
Yeah, and I'm by no means am I suggesting like don't use these tools to optimize your workflows. I think there are like really valid use cases where this stuff can be very helpful to augment your skills. But I would just caution over reliance on these things right now, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Well, chaps, Zach, Chris, it's been an absolutely fantastic conversation. I think we could probably still keep going for another hour, but thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your experience, insights today. I'm sure kind of listeners will walk away with a better understanding of the Web3 hiring space and the tools that they need to succeed, both as founders and candidates. And then to our listeners, if you've enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a review, and we'll catch you next time on the Open Source Podcast. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Zach. Really appreciate you both.
Yeah, thank you, Bruce.
Okay.
Appreciate you having us.